You were born in you were born in Cheyenne, is that right?
Right.
And when was that?
On March 18th, 1920.
1920.
And my mother tells me it was in a terrible windstorm.
Have you always lived at 3000 Cribben?
Yes, it is until I was married.
Until you were married. Can you remember some of the people that you went to school with, to high school, junior high?
Oh, very well, yes.
There's some notable names in that list, isn't there?
Well, I'm trying to think. There were a number of very prominent businessmen. And one of my classmates became a rather famous general in the Air Force during World War II.
Well, when was Alan Simpson and this attorney, I can't remember his name. They're both from Cheyenne. You didn't go to school with those?
No. Alan Simpson would have been later than I was at the university. See, he came from Cody.
Oh, I see.
But he was at the university, but just a few years after I was.
When did you first start playing the violin, and who gave you your first lessons?
Well, my mother gave me piano lessons for 5 years before I was ever allowed to start on the violin. But my father gave me my first lessons when I was about 12 years old.
Do you remember the first symphony that you played in?
Yes, indeed I do. It was really not a full-blown symphony, but small orchestra that my folks had put together. And we practiced in my mother's studio at home. And one of my most vivid recollections is playing second violin, and I was actually backed into the fireplace because it was so crowded.
And where did you attend college?
Well, I had 2 years at Park College, which is a small Presbyterian college at Parkville, Missouri. And then, following that, I had 3 years at the University of Wyoming.
3 years at UW. Now, so did you get a degree while you were at Park?
No. In 2 years, I couldn't have gotten any kind of degree, but of course my credits there were transferred to the University of Wyoming, and I did get 2 degrees at the University of Wyoming.
Okay, that's what I was thinking. How did you choose Park College?
Well, I graduated from high school at the end of the Great Depression in 1938, and my folks were, well, not really dirt poor, but they didn't have a lot of money to spend. And Park College was a small religious oriented college where all the students were allowed to work to fulfill part of their tuition needs. Okay. I think we all had to work at least 15 hours a week.
Well, you didn't attend school the year round, though, did you?
No, I always went home for Christmas and for the summer vacation.
And how did you spend your summer vacations?
Usually, the summer was spent practicing and preparing a recital.
Oh.
But then in my year between Park College and the university, I had gotten a job at Estes Park in the YM and YWCA camp.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a little quartet there. We played dinner music and played for a Quaker singing group that came from Kansas. It was a wonderful summer.
This is Estes Park, Colorado?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, how did you meet Dad?
He was one of the first Wyoming people I met at Park College. And strangely enough, I thought that handsome, dark-haired, dark-eyed man had to be from New York City.
Mm.
I was terribly disappointed when I found he was from Gillette, Wyoming.
And do you remember how you came to meet him while you were there?
Well, we had, everyone had to go to church on Sunday. And I can remember walking up the hill, and I was behind him. And he was with some fellows. And someone said, had I met Joe Hoadley from Wyoming? And of course I had not.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when I met him. It was on a Sunday, going up the hill to lunch.
After church.
After church.
I should have asked Dad this question too, but how did Dad propose to you?
Oh, that's one of the embarrassments of my life. Well, we were seated in an automobile in St. Louis, in Forest Park, in front of the Art Museum. And it was a lovely evening. Of course, we were doing a little necking, you know. But he asked me if I would marry him, and I said, mm-hmm. And he didn't know whether I had said mm-hmm or mm-mm. So he had to ask me twice.
That was St. Louis, you said?
Yeah.
So he would have been in medical school?
Yeah, well, he was an intern at that time.
Okay.
At Deaconess Hospital.
Where was the first place that you and Dad lived?
We lived in St. Louis. We had an apartment above a grocery store.
Hmm.
It was very hot in the summer.
And he was doing his residency then?
Yeah.
When was Frank born, and where were you living then?
Frank was born in St. Louis, and that would have been November 3rd, 1944. And he was born in the hospital where your dad had been doing his internship. At that time, though, he was working in a hospital far down in South St. Louis, a big Lutheran hospital.
And Jeanette?
Jeanette was born in the old Hoadley Hospital in Gillette. This is a hospital that was owned by your grandpa and your dad.
Huh.
And David was also born there.
Okay, so when you went to Hawaii, was Frank the only one that went to Hawaii?
No, Jeanette went in a basket. She was only a few months old.
So you were living at Gillette when you went to Hawaii then?
Actually, I was living with my mother and father because I remember distinctly my mother drove the car for me to take me out to San Francisco to catch the steamship. We went over on the old Mariposa, which was still in wartime gray.
Anything, can you remember taking that trip? What was taking the trip like?
It was pleasant. I didn't meet very many people because I was more or less tied down with two small children.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was no socializing. But I remember the food was excellent, and there was a nice little Filipino steward who came and looked in on me every once in a while. It was kind of a nice trip. It was my first ocean voyage.
Mm-hmm. And what year was this?
That had to have been 1944.
1944.
Mm-hmm. No, wait a minute. Jeanette was born in 1946. So that was the year.
46.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm heading for Gillette.
Okay.
Had a good trip back. Glad you came up.
What time should I expect you?
4 o'clock.
Okay. Be careful.
Okay.
So you finally moved to Gillette when?
Actually, it would have been early 1947.
So you weren't in Hawaii for very long then.
Jeanette and Frank and I were there about 4 months.
Mm.
But they were lovely 4 months.
Mm-hmm. And when did you move into the big house in 5th and Rockpile?
We built that house in the late fall and early winter of 1950. So we must have moved into it in early 1951.
In 51.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Dad said I was just sure I had lived in that smaller house, but I knew that wasn't.
No, you hadn't. And David lived there only as a very small infant.
Mm. What was the worst time of your life?
Oh. I think it's probably when I lost people I loved very much.
Mm-hmm.
My father, I remember losing him, and my mother, and then I had a teacher at the university whom I adored, and he died just a few weeks before my mother.
Hmm. And the best time? Can you think of the best?
Actually, my life has been very happy most of the time. It's maybe the last 10 years have been the best because your father hasn't been tied down by professional work, and I haven't been doing a lot of teaching or anything like that tied me down, so that we had a lot more time together. And we've done a lot of traveling. And our travel has always been very satisfying,
Mm-hmm.
very enjoyable.
If you hadn't married Dad, who might you have married?
What a question. Well, I know whom I would like to have married, but it would not be likely.
Who would that be?
Oh, well, probably that teacher that I thought so much of
Mm-hmm.
at the university.
Mm-hmm.
And later he had a very sad and stormy marriage to another woman. But the die was cast a long time ago.
Well, why don't I tape you playing the fiddle or the piano or something?
Okay, which would you rather have?
Oh, it doesn't matter.
Well, I'll use the violin, but this violin that I'm using is not my best. Do you remember the Gratz family?
The Gratz sisters?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
They had one brother, and he had died, perhaps along 1952, something like that. And the sisters asked me to play for his funeral, which I did, because the family was very fond of your dad. He made house calls out to the ranch and took care of William for a couple of years. And after a few years, they sort of gave up on the ranching business. They were all elderly, and so they sold their ranch to a coal company. Probably made a lot of money that way. But they moved back to Pennsylvania, and they didn't know what to do with William's violin, so they gave it to me. And I've never done very much with it until recently. Bob Becker, my old violin prof, was here a couple of summers ago, and he played it, and he said, "Well, this is a pretty good violin." And then he suggested that I have my violin technician in Billings put a couple of coats of gunstock varnish on it. He said, that will bring the body together so that it will have a more solid sound. And actually, it's not too bad a violin, but it's not my best.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So. Good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, you were born in Missouri, is that correct?
Yes, I was born in Canesville, Missouri, January 12th, 1913.
1913. Okay, well, I guessed 1912. Let's see, do you have any memories of living in Missouri?
Well, not any very clear memories. After all, I was less than 4 years old when we left there. I can remember my Grandpa Hoadley coming up to see us and occasionally taking us a ride in his very ancient automobile. It was about the latest thing. I'm not sure it was a Model T, but I know he'd honk his horn and take us for a ride, and sometimes we'd race him down the street.
How did you come to Campbell County?
We came to Campbell County in an immigrant car. No, that's not quite correct. Dad came to Campbell County with a friend he'd teamed up with by the name of Troxel. They drove out in a car. Took them almost a month. They got stuck several times and homesteaded, and then he sent for Mother and we two boys to come, and we rode the coach on the train. But all of our furniture and livestock and equipment of various kinds came in an immigrant car.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember that trip out?
Well, very little. I think the only thing I can remember is that in those days trains were not air conditioned, and we rode with the window open, and sometimes we kids stuck our heads out the window, and Frank got a cinder in his eye.
Frank got a cinder in his eye from the engine?
Yes, and the conductor came along and took his handkerchief and turned his eyelid and got the cinder out.
Do you remember the first house that you lived in?
Oh, yes. Well, talking about Missouri or Wyoming?
Wyoming.
Yes, it was a one-roomed house. I think it was low on the north side and high. It was a slanting roof. 8 feet on the south side, 6 feet on the low side. I'm not sure of the dimensions, but I would think about 14 by 16.
Mm-hmm. Now the old house that was just burned down, is that where the original house was?
That's where the original house was.
And they just moved it off or tore it down? And
Well, moved it off. I presume tore it down. Now, it was added on to periodically during the number of years we lived there, but the original room was still there up until it was abolished and the new house built.
Hmm. And when was that? Do you remember when that was? You weren't living there.
I wasn't living there. I was in college at the time. I guess in medical school. I think that was done really during World War II. Somewhere about 1942 perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Can you think of any funny story to tell about your mother?
Well, let's see. Let's tell about Mother. Oh, really I can't. I remember Mother's always been very hardworking and quite a gardener, and she worked very hard to raise a garden, a vegetable garden out there in Wyoming, so we always had fresh fruit and fresh vegetables. Very little fruit. We did occasionally raise a few strawberries. They never did very well because it was dry.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I really don't think I can. She taught school for a couple of years, drove a single horse and a buggy back and forth to school about 5 miles each way. Taught school way over by what was known as the Cooksey School, not far from where Milo Haight lives now.
Mm-hmm.
Had to ford the Belfish River, opened several gates each way.
She did that on a horse and carriage.
A horse and spring buggy.
Mm.
Spring buggy's a lighter piece of equipment than a carriage.
Mm. Now you went to school in a one-room schoolhouse. Do you remember who your teacher was at that time?
My first grade teacher was a neighbor woman, the name of Grace Nail.
Grace Nail.
Yes. The Nail homestead is still there. It now belongs to the Haydens, about 4 miles north of our place.
Okay.
Mrs. Nail always rode back and forth to school horseback.
Who else did you attend school with?
Other students?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Lilly children, boy and girl. I think the girl's name was Thelma. Can't think of the boy's name. Harold, I believe. And they lived a mile west from where we did. We now own their homestead.
Okay. Trying to remember which way is west and east out there. You and Archie Lindsay knew each other real well. You went to school with him?
No, I never went to school with Archie. Archie was a pupil of Mother's and lived over there and went to the Cooksey School. And occasionally I'd go to school with Mother and visit school, and I got acquainted with Archie. And then we in community affairs, why we would visit back and forth, and we got acquainted with the Lindsays. And then really after World War II, I really got best acquainted with Archie.
Mm.
When Archie was in business at Gillette, and Archie's grocery store was almost across the street from my office for many years. In regard to Archie and Mother teaching school, there's kind of an interesting incident, but Mother gave Archie his first paddling. And Archie was always a good kid, but Archie was telling me about the episode just this last winter. Said that the Cooksey Lake was off, and I remember it very quite well, it was a quarter or half a mile from the schoolhouse. And the kids always had the desire to go down there and play at recess. But Mother was afraid they'd get in trouble down there, and she strictly forbid them to go to the lake during recess. One day at the noon hour, they ate lunch real fast, and they all took off and went to the lake. And Archie fell in, got all muddy and all wet. And when Mother rang the school bell, they all rushed back to school, except Archie. He was so muddy and so wet, he wouldn't come. So Mother took the yardstick and went after Archie down there and scolded him and paddled him every step of the way home with the yardstick.
Now, Ruth and Louise also went to country school out there, too.
Ruth did, but not Louise. When the family moved to town, of course, Frank and I, my brother Frank and I, we never 100% made the transition into town. We ran the ranch. But for a number of years, Dad practiced medicine at a country practice out there and rode horseback all over southern Campbell County. And also during those years, beginning in the late 20s, Dad would go into town occasionally and relieve Dr. J.S. Hunter, who had an office in town. Dr. Hunter was getting older and more failing health, and when he was ill or wanted to take a period of rest or they'd take a trip, Dad would go in and run Dr. Hunter's office. And in 1931, Dr. Hunter died. And he died in the hospital over at Hot Springs, South Dakota. And Dad was covering Dr. Hunter's office at the time. And that left Gillette without a doctor other than Dad. So they persuaded Dad to buy out Dr. Hunter's practice and take over his office. And so the Hoadleys really made the transition to town in May of 1931. I remember the date quite well because that's the date that I graduated from high school.
You graduated in 1931?
Yes.
May. Well, now, how did Ruth get to and from school?
Ruth got to and from school on horseback, a little Shetland pony by the name of Coley.
Coley didn't like going to school very well.
No, Coley was kind of stubborn, like many little Shetlands. He was gentle, but also he was stubborn. And Ruth wasn't very big and not a very good horsewoman, and especially when she was just 6 years old. And she could ride Coley up to the top of the hill, and then Coley'd stand up there and look back at the barn and turn around and start bringing Ruth back home again. And so he, especially my brother Frank then, would have to whip Coley and make Coley go. And I remember one time he was whipping Coley and whipped Ruth right along the leg and made a big dark mark on her leg. But I think the last battle he really had with Coley was after whipping Coley about twice one morning. Coley again went up to the top of the hill and turned around and looked back. Frank picked up a board about 10 feet long, waved it in the air and started after Coley, and Coley took one look at that big club and went right on over the hill and went to school.
See, I didn't learn this until a year or maybe 2 years ago, but you're missing part of your ear. Is that right?
Well, not really, but it is a little bit deformed.
Mm-hmm. How did that happen?
Well, that happened in a fight with a would-be horse thief. Or at least I assumed he was a would-be horse thief. We had a neighbor by the name of D. Moore that didn't have had sort of a savory reputation. And we were thrashing one year in the fall, and of course everybody was busy. And D. Moore and a fellow companion of his rode in our north gate. Instead of coming on up by the house and stopping and visiting like most neighbors did, he stayed clear out away from the buildings and proceeded on and went over the hill into our south pasture. We had cattle and horses over in that south pasture. And Dad says, I'm just afraid they're up to no good. I'm busy here with the thrashing crew, but why don't you get on the horse and ride over there and see what they're doing? Well, I don't know just what persuaded me, but I guess it was youth enthusiasm. I went in the house and got the old 30-30 Savage rifle, or the 303 Savage rifle, which I still have among my souvenirs, locked up here in my treasures here in the house. And jumped on the old bay mare and rode over the hill to see what they were doing. Well, when I came in sight of them, why, they had all of our horses gathered up against the fence and had taken the fence down, had it stapled down to the bottoms of the posts, and as it appeared to me, were preparing to steal the horses. Well, I rode down there and asked them what they were doing, and we had a little bit of an argument. And finally Dee says, if you get off of that horse, I'll stomp the guts out of you. Well, I just piled off. And when I turned around to face him, why, there he was, coming after me with a great big heavy pair of fencing pliers that are also a hammer as well as a pair of pliers.
Mm-hmm.
I have a pair like that out in the shop. I just threw a shell in that old 303 Savage and leveled down on him with my finger tickling the trigger. And he stopped immediately and turned very gray and green. And turned around and tied his pliers back on his saddle. As we argued a little more, he says, if you put that gun down, I'll still stomp the guts out of you. So I laid the gun down and we had a little fist fight. He got me down and pretty well chewed my ear off. And his companion told him he thought that was enough, and everybody got back on their horses, and I followed them until they left the pasture. And after they put the fence back up, and then I rode on home. Dad had to take me into town and have some surgery work done on my ear and stitched it back together.
And which ear is it?
Well, I'd feel it and tell for sure. What's this one? It doesn't show very much anymore. There's a little notch in it right there that I can feel, and the cartilage is rough.
Uh-huh.
To smooth it in yet.
But they didn't get the horses.
They didn't get the horses.
You went on a lot of house calls with your dad. Can you think of any house call in particular that you remember making with your dad?
Well, I suppose you're probably thinking of way back while we lived on the ranch, maybe. I don't know. I did go with Dad a number of times. Dad, in his early years of practice out there, in the teens, did almost everything horseback. I think it was about 1921, we got an old Model T Ford. That old Model T Ford my grandpa and Grandpa Hoadley drove that out from Missouri and sold it to Dad. And I think it was about a 1916 model. It didn't have a hood. The dash came right straight up in front, right on into the windshield. There was no place really to fasten a hood to protect the motor and coils and so forth. Whenever it rained, it would drown out and go dead. Had a box on the back, a wooden box on the back, and just one seat, and you sat on this seat, which rested on top of the gasoline tank. But it was quite a little improvement over horseback.
Mm-hmm.
And I did make several trips with Dad, because there was a gate every mile or such matter. Roads in those days were just two-wheel tracks, and they went from one homestead house to another. And of course, wherever there were boundary lines between the homesteads, to get through the farmyard, and past the pigs and the chickens and the cows. Why, there was gates, people's yards, and gates at their fence and boundary lines. And I know that we made a call over close to Savageton one time and opened 30-some gates, both going and coming. And I could jump out and open gates, and Dad could drive on through.
Now, you didn't always live on the ranch. See, I think we've already covered that. You moved into town in '31. Is that when you came into town?
My mother and Dad went to town, and Brother Frank and I continued to run the ranch for a year or so. However, we were in there most weekends and things like that, and back and forth for groceries. And spent quite a little time in town. I graduated from high school in '31. I did, I guess in the fall of '31, I did go back and took a few more classes in high school. I studied Spanish and physics and so forth that year. And then it was a cold winter and so much feeding to do out at the ranch that after Christmas went back out to the ranch and never did finish those courses. The year after that, I went back in and lived with the folks and took what we called normal training, which was a full year, and I got university credit for it. Then I became a school teacher. Taught school, country school, for 2 years.
So you taught school in '33 and '34 then? Or thereabouts?
Yes. What would it have been? The fall of '33, spring of '34. In the fall of '34, spring of '35, and in the fall of 1935, I left and went to college, took pre-med.
And where were you teaching school at?
It's what they called the New Hope School. It was out on the 4J Road, about 15 or 16 miles, out toward Mankin's Ranch.
That be beyond Barclays or before Barclays?
Just beyond Barclays.
So you left for college in, I think you said
Fall of '35.
And where did you go to college?
Park College at Parkville, Missouri.
Now, I asked you this question a year or two ago. Did you always want to be a doctor? When and how did you decide to become a doctor?
Well, no, I don't know. I always really wanted to be a doctor. I guess I was always a little interested in it. But I was, I'd say, more interested in science. And I just when I left for college, I maybe had that vague thought in the back of my mind that maybe I would become a doctor. But it looked like really too big a jump to even be hopeful for, because I didn't see how we were going to come up for the finances. But I also was interested in teaching school, and so I was really, in a way, playing both ends against the middle. I went away to college with a major in science, and thought either I'll go on into medicine or dentistry, or else I will get a teaching degree and teach science in high school. So I was sort of preparing for either one.
Mm-hmm. What finally led you to go into pre-med and on to medical school?
Well, I'll tell you, there was a young fellow I met on the train. I always went back and forth to college on the train, at least most of the time I did. And I met a medical student, might have been a resident at the time, but a young man from Billings. I used to know his name, but I have forgotten. I think that's the only time I ever met him. But we sat together on our away on the train for about all day, and told him what I was doing, and I thought maybe I'd teach school, science in high school, and he said, no, don't do that. Just take the bit in your teeth and go ahead and decide to be a doctor. And he sort of persuaded me.
Mm-hmm. How did you decide on Park College? Rather than university?
It was sort of a little romance. I was a young lady spent the summer, a friend of the Hunters. Spent the summer in Gillette, and we dated quite a little bit. That was the year I was teaching school, or had been teaching school, and she just talked me into. I told her, I said, I don't know if I can afford to go to college. And she said, well, go to Park College, and they give you a job. You work 15 hours a week, and that cuts your room and board way down, and you definitely can afford to go to Park College. So I went.
Was this anybody that we know?
No, I don't think so. I don't think. It was the only summer, and of course she had already graduated from Park College. I don't know, I think she took a job someplace. Never saw her after that summer.
Huh. Now, after you finished at Park, did you go straight to medical school after that?
Oh yes, I went straight on to medical school.
Now, Park doesn't have a medical school.
No. Applied to 2 or 3 different medical schools, 3 or 4 probably, and got turned down at about half of them. Was finally accepted to Creighton and accepted to St. Louis U. I chose St. Louis U.
And then after your medical school, you had to do an internship and a residency. Did you do those together?
Well, no. Of course, now before I graduated from medical school, why, the World War II started. And they changed their curriculum quite a little bit. And we had the option, or at least a strong possibility, that if we would enlist, that then we could be transferred into the reserves and deferred in the reserve program to continue in medical school. So I enlisted in the Army. And immediately on the same day transferred from the Army into the reserves in order to continue my medical education. And then we had to take military classes, and we had to do some drilling and study military science. Involved a little extra work, 2 or 3 classes a week. And so stayed in the reserves. I graduated from medical school and then thought I might have to go immediately, but got deferred. I add that under this program we had to go to school 12 months a year to have summer vacation involved. And so graduated early then in my senior year. So I graduated in June, I graduated in January, and then got further deferment through reserves to do a 9-month internship instead of a 12, and deferred for 2 9-month periods of surgery residency. And after 18 months of surgery residency, went into the military.
And so you actually got your MD when?
In January of 1943.
And where did you do your residency?
At did a 9-month internship and 9-month surgery residency at Deaconess Hospital in St. Louis. and a 9-month surgery residency at Lutheran Hospital in St. Louis.
And so when you finally went with reserves, where did you go with them?
Well, I didn't have to go away anyplace with reserves. Went into active duty then after my second residency.
Okay.
Did reserves right there at the university,
All right.
taking military classes.
But when you finally went active duty, then you had to leave St. Louis.
Yes, went to boot training camp in Carlisle, is that correct? Carlisle Barracks at Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
But you ended up in Hawaii, too.
Well, went from Carlisle Barracks to Camp Atterbury at Indianapolis, Indiana, and from there to Hawaii. In Hawaii, I did ear, nose, and throat work.
But you managed to miss Pearl Harbor.
Got there just after Pearl Harbor. See, Pearl Harbor was the start. Well, the Battle of Pearl Harbor, which it's famous for, that was the start of World War II, as far as the United States is concerned. I was a medical student, freshman. No, maybe a sophomore.
Mm-hmm.
December the 7th, and I can remember very well sitting in my room studying when I heard it over the radio.
And when did you meet Mom?
Well, I met Mom at Park College, and I guess the year I was a senior and she was a freshman.
How did you manage to meet her?
Oh, I was kind of looking over lists of classmates as to who was from where, and when I found she was from Wyoming, I made it a point to look her up and meet her.
So you met Mom while you were at Park, then you went on to medical school after that.
She went to Wyoming U, but we kept corresponding all those years.
Do you remember meeting her folks?
I never met her folks till after Frances and I were engaged. Okay, made a trip home, a trip or two to Wyoming when I was a resident, my second year of residency, I guess. And met her folks.
How did that go, meeting the folks?
Oh, quite well.
Mm-hmm.
No ups or downs or rough spots at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good. And when did you get married?
August the 30th. And, I'm going to be 48 years this coming August. So I guess 43 now, 1943.
And where were you married?
In Presbyterian Church, Cheyenne.
Mm.
Had a reception at the Ross's house, 3,000 ribbon.
Mm-hmm.
Afterwards, went out to dinner that night. The Hoadley family and the Ross family and everybody at the Plains Hotel. And they all followed us down to the depot, and we got on the train and headed to St. Louis.
Mm.
So I could finish my internship and residency.
So you didn't really take a honeymoon trip then?
Well, yes, we did. Along the way, I bought a little Nash car. Pretty nice little car. But I couldn't get enough gasoline or have enough time off from a residency to drive to Wyoming. Gas rationing was so strict. 2 or 3 of the doctors gave me a few gas coupons. I drove the car to Kansas City and stored it in a garage in Kansas City. Got on the train and went on out to Cheyenne to get married. And then we took the train from Cheyenne back to Kansas City and got the car. Went down and spent 4 or 5 days in the Ozarks. Then drove on to St. Louis. In the meantime, I had rented an apartment in St. Louis. Moved into an apartment.
How long did you live where you would have stayed there until you finished medical school?
Well, I'd already finished medical school. I was an intern at the time. But Frances and I lived in St. Louis a year and a half before I left for there.
Now, while you were in the Army, did Mom go with you?
Yes, even against all the military advice, because the war was still going on, but I didn't want to be separated, so she went to Carlisle with me, where we had a small apartment and a private home. A couple rooms and a private home. And then after I got shipped overseas, I didn't know what was in store for me. I figured there would be some desolate island where we could not have families, but when I got assigned in Honolulu, in fact, there were about 40 doctors or so of us. We all went over on a troop ship. And been to a military base there in Honolulu for reassignment. And one by one, they were calling those doctors out, and they were going to Christmas Island and other desolate places in the deep Pacific. And the colonel issued a call for me one day, and I went into the colonel's office and see what desolated spot I was going to go to, and he says, "Hoadley, can you take out a pair of tonsils?" I says, "You bet I can take out tonsils." So, okay, I'm going to assign you the Crippler General here in Honolulu in the ear, nose, and throat department.
Now, Mom came over to Hawaii.
So after I was assigned and had a permanent assignment there in Honolulu, I sent for Frances, and she and Frank and Jeanette came over on a passenger's liner.
How? So Frank and Jeanette had both come along at this point in time.
Right. Jeanette was in a bassinet.
So when did you begin practicing in Gillette?
Just right soon after New Year's of 46. Made it home in time for Christmas and New Year's dinner. 45. I think that's right.
And where was your first office at?
It was on the corner, an old little building that belonged to Bill Wright. And it had been Dad's office for some several years. But it leaked, it was old, and it was not very good. But it was on the corner where now Probst Boot and Saddle is. Immediately across the street south from what used to be the Stockings Bank is now the First Interstate Bank.
Immediately, which direction now?
South, up the street toward the high school.
Okay, so that would be where the, Naker's Boot and Saddle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Used to be a dentist office in there.
The dentist's office was next door. And I think Boot and Saddle's probably absorbed both of those locations.
Yeah. Okay. And what was your first house in Gillette that you and Mom lived in?
It was a little house on rock pile, and forgotten the number. It must have been about 321 rock pile. Let's see, as you go out 4th Street, 4th Street, there's where the stoplight is. You go out to rock pile and then turn north down toward the Legion Hall. You'll be halfway down the block on the east side of the street. It's a little white house.
Okay.
You lived there a few years.
Oh, I did. Now, when did you build that big house on 5th and Rockpile?
Well, I have to think about that a bit. Mom could probably tell you, but about 1950, plus or minus.
Okay. In 56 or 57, thereabouts, you wrecked an airplane. Where were you going, or where had you been? And do you actually remember the crash itself?
Well, I remember several things about it. At that time, I was president of the Wyoming Cancer Society and was quite active in the society. And I did quite a lot of speaking at clubs and different organizations all around the state on various cancer subjects. And especially spoke to lay groups about danger signals and urging the women to get pap smears and breast self-examination to discover their cancer early. And I had flown my airplane to Cody and back the day before, and it spoke in Cody. And the next day I was supposed to speak at a luncheon meeting in Douglas and then on to Cheyenne to speak at Rotary that night. And so I'd flown back from Cody, and the airplane was a little low on gas when I'd arrived close to dark and had put it away. The next morning when I got it out to fly it to Douglas, why, the only time I can ever remember that the airport at Gillette was out of gasoline. And I said, well, I've got plenty to go to Douglas, no problem. But it was a little low. But the weather wasn't very good. And radio communications were not as good then. You could not call any of the flight stations from Gillette unless you made a long distance call on the telephone. Weather wasn't very good, but anyway I took off thinking I'd have no problem to fly to Douglas. If I could get out about 30 or 40 miles south, then I could pick up Casper on the weather radio. Well, the weather looked pretty bad to the south, and I took off. So thunderstorms were so heavy that I never did get Casper on the radio. I just beyond right, I flew into pretty heavy rain. Flew into that rain and turned around, headed back north and looked like I could fly around at the end to the east. And I tried to turn south again, got into the rain again, and turned back, and went farther east. And finally, I forgot all about being low out on gas. I was kind of fighting that rainstorm. Finally, right over the town of Lusk, I ran out of gas. I quick got the motor started again, switching to the other tank. At that time, I was really pretty well shook up and I was disoriented. I didn't know exactly where I was. I wasn't even sure what town I was over. And I saw an alfalfa field and decided to land in that alfalfa field. And just as I was about to touch down, I saw a fence and a ditch and a power line all looming up ahead of me. My first thought was, I'll go under the power line and over the fence. And I decided, well, I could go over the top of the power line. I hooked the landing gear on the power line. Tore the power line all down. And that is the last I remember until I was on the ground. And I had always supposed that I crashed right there when I hit the power line. But eyewitnesses told me later that no, I flew right on through the power line, flew out till almost went out of sight and turned around and came back to the same alfalfa field and cut the motor like I was going to glide in and land, but I never did pull back on the yoke and flatten out to land. I just glided right on into the ground.
You finally retired from your practice in Gillette. What year was that? Do you remember?
December of '79.
Was there anything in particular that caused you to retire when you did?
Well, of course I was 67. I was old enough to retire. At least I was almost 67. I was 67 in January. But I developed severe coronary problems and had a small heart attack while hunting elk that fall. And then I went to a cardiologist and he did some tests, stress tests, and sent me to Denver. I said I had a serious heart problem. And in January, I had bypass surgery and had 2 coronaries, one totally occluded and another one almost occluded. 5 bypasses in January of '79. So I decided kind of time to get the practice closed up, dispose of it, and retire.
So you actually practiced for, what, 33 years then?
Well, I always call it 35, but I did go back to Gillette and do a little work then in '80, but I guess 35 years.
After 35 years of practicing and 79 years of living, do you have, if there was anything that you could do differently, can you think of what that might have been?
Well, gosh, I really don't know. I had the opportunity to go into a clinic in St. Louis, and it was tempting, but Dad wanted me to come back out here so badly, and my heart was always in Wyoming.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always been glad I didn't go into the clinic. Maybe I'd have made more money in St. Louis, I don't know. But as far as medical practice, no. I've made some mistakes, judgments in error here and there, but all in all, I had a very successful practice. I had a big practice, and I did a lot of good. a lot of good experiences. Did lots of country work, which the doctors just don't do anymore. I made house calls to the majority of the ranches in Camel County and into many of the ranches in Crook and Weston County.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the ranches into Sheridan County. It was good practice, been a good life, and I don't know what's much I'd change.
Good. Off the top of your head, how many babies do you think you birthed?
Well, somewhere about around 2000.
You did 2,000 babies?
Mm-hmm.
Well, good. I don't have any more questions. Thank you.
You're welcome.